cut in the latest trendy fashion, and manicured fingers. His medium grey suit was from Savile Row. His heavy silk tie was from Cardin. There was an air of expensive good taste, of the kind money can buy, about him. If looks had been his only asset, he would not have been one of West Germany's wealthiest and most successful magazine publishers. Starting after the war with a hand-operated press, turning out handbills for the British occupation authorities, he had founded in 1949 one of the first weekly picture magazines. His formula was simple: tell it in words and make it shocking, then back it up with pictures that made all competitors look like novices with their first box brownie. It worked. His chain of 8 magazines, ranging from love stories for teenagers to the glossy chronicle of the doings of the rich and sexy, had made him a multimillionaire. But Comet, the news and current affairs magazine, was still his favourite, his baby. The money had bought him a luxurious ranch-style house at Ottmarschen, a chalet in the mountains, a villa by the sea, a Rolls-Royce, and a Ferrari. Along the way he had picked up a beautiful wife, whom he dressed from Paris, and 2 handsome children he seldom saw. The only millionaire in Germany whose succession of young mistresses, discreetly maintained and frequently exchanged, were never photographed in his gossip magazine, was Hans Hoffmann. He was also very astute. That Wednesday afternoon he closed the cover of the diary of Salomon Tauber after reading the preface, leaned back, and looked at the young reporter opposite. "All right. I can guess the rest. What do you want?" "I think it's a great document," said Miller. "There's a man mentioned throughout the diary called Edward Roschmann, captain in the SS, commandant of Rigo ghetto throughout, killed 80,000 men, women and children. I believe he's alive and here in West Germany. I want to find him." "How do you know he's alive?" Miller told him briefly. Hoffmann pursed his lips. "Pretty thin evidence." "True, but worth a second look. I brought home stories that started on less." Hoffmann grinned, recalling Miller's talent for ferreting out stories that hurt the establishment. Hoffmann had been happy to print them once they were checked out as accurate. They sent circulation soaring. "Then presumably this man, what do you call him, Roschmann, presumably he's already on the wanted list. If the police can't find him, what makes you think you can?" "Are the police really looking?" asked Miller. Hoffmann shrugged. "They're supposed to. That's what we pay them for." "It wouldn't hurt to help a little, would it? Just check out whether he's really alive, whether he was ever picked up. If so, what happened to him?" "So what do you want from me?" asked Hoffmann. "A commission to give it a try. If nothing comes of it, I drop it." Hoffmann swung in his chair, spinning round to face the picture windows looking out over the sprawling docks, mile after mile of cranes and wharves, spread out 20 floors below and a mile away. "It's a bit out of your line of country, Miller. Why the sudden interest?" Miller thought hard. Trying to sell an idea was always the hardest part. A freelance reporter has to sell the story, or the idea of the story, to the publisher or the editor first. The public comes much later. "It's a good human interest story. If Comet could find the man where the police forces of the country had failed, it would be a beat, something people want to know about." Hoffmann gazed out at the December skyline and slowly shook his head. "You're wrong. That's why I'm not giving you a commission for it. I should think it's the last thing people want to know about. But look, Herr Hoffmann, this is different. These people Roschmann killed, they weren't Poles and Russians. These were Germans, all right, German Jews, but they were Germans. Why wouldn't people want to know about it?" Hoffmann spun back from the window, put his elbows on the desk, and rested his chin on his knuckles. "Miller, you're a good reporter. I like the way you cover a story. You've got style. And you're a ferret. I can hire 20, 50, 100 men in this city by picking up the phone, and they'll all do what they're told, cover the stories they're sent to cover. But they can't dig out a story for themselves. You can. That's why you get a lot of work from me, and will get a lot more in the future, but not this one." "But why? It's a good story." "Listen, you're young. I'll tell you something about journalism. Half of journalism is about writing good stories. The other half is about selling them. You can do the first, but I can do the second. That's why I'm here and you're there. You think this is a story everyone will want to read because the victims of Riga were German Jews. I'm telling you, that's exactly why no one will want to read the story. It's the last story in the world they'll want to read. And until there's a law in this country forcing people to buy magazines and read what's good for them, they'll go on buying magazines to read what they want to read. And that's what I give them, what they want to read. Then why not about Roshman? You still don't get it. Then I'll tell you. Before the war, just about everyone in Germany knew one Jew. The fact is, before Hitler started, nobody hated the Jews in Germany. We had the best record of treatment of our Jewish minority of any country in Europe. Better than France, better than Spain, infinitely better than Poland and Russia, where the pogroms were fiendish. Then Hitler started, telling people the Jews were to blame for the First World War, the unemployment, the poverty, and everything else that was wrong. People didn't know what to believe. Almost everyone knew one Jew who was a nice guy, or just harmless. People had Jewish friends, Jewish employers, good employers, Jewish employees, hard workers. They obeyed the laws, they didn't hurt anyone, and here was Hitler saying they were to blame for everything. So, when the vans came and took them away, people didn't do anything. They stayed out of the way, they kept quiet. They even got to believing the voice that shouted the loudest, because that's the way people are, particularly the Germans. We're a very obedient people. It's our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. It enables us to build an economic miracle while the British are on strike, and it enables us to follow a man like Hitler into a great big mass grave. For years, people haven't asked what happened to the Jews of Germany. They just disappeared, nothing else. It's bad enough to read at every war crimes trial what happened to the faceless, anonymous Jews of Warsaw, Lublin, Białystok, nameless, unknown Jews from Poland and Russia. Now you want to tell them chapter and verse what happened to their next-door neighbours. Now can you understand it? These Jews, he tapped the diary, these people they knew, they greeted them in the street, they bought in their shops, and they stood around while they were taken away for Herr Roshman to deal with. You think they want to read about that? You couldn't have picked a story that people in Germany want to read about less. Having finished, Hans Hoffmann leaned back, selected a fine panatella from a humidor on the desk, and lit it from a rolled gold Dupont. Miller sat and digested what he had not been able to work out for himself. "That must have been what my mother meant," he said at length. Hoffmann grunted. "Probably. I still want to find that bastard." "Leave it alone, Miller. Drop it. No one will thank you. That's not the only reason, is it? The public reaction. There's another reason, isn't there?" Hoffmann eyed him keenly through the cigar smoke. "Yes," he said shortly. "Are you afraid of them? Still?" asked Miller. Hoffmann shook his head. "No. I just don't go looking for trouble. That's all." "What kind of trouble?" "Have you ever heard of a man called Hans Haber?" asked Hoffmann. "The novelist, yes. What about him?" "He used to run a magazine in Munich once, back in the early 50s. A good one, too. He was a damn good reporter, like you. Echo of the Week, it was called. He hated the Nazis, so he ran a series of exposures of former SS men living in freedom in Munich." "What happened to him?" "To him? Nothing. One day he got more mail than usual. Half the letters were from his advertisers, withdrawing their custom. Another was from his bank, asking him to drop round. When he did, he was told the bank was foreclosing on the overdraft as of that minute. Within a week, the magazine was out of business. Now he writes novels, good ones too. But he doesn't run a magazine anymore." "So what do the rest of us do? Keep running scared?" Hoffmann jerked his cigar out of his mouth. "I don't have to take that from you, Miller," he said, his eyes snapping. "I hated the bastards then, and I hate them now. But I know my readers, and they don't want to know about Edward Roshman. All right, I'm sorry. But I'm still going to cover it. You know, Miller, if I didn't know you, I'd think there was something personal behind it. Never let journalism get personal. It's bad for reporting, and it's bad for the reporter. Anyway, how are you going to finance yourself? I've got some savings. Miller rose to go. Best of luck, said Hoffman, rising and coming round the desk. I'll tell you what I'll do. The day Roschmann is arrested and imprisoned by the West German police, I'll commission you to cover the story. That's straight news, so it's public property. If I decide not to print, I'll buy it out of my pocket. That's as far as I'll go. But while you're digging for him, you're not carrying the letterhead of my magazine around as your authority. Miller nodded. I'll be back, he said. Chapter 5. That same Wednesday morning was also the time of the week when the heads of the 5 branches of the Israeli intelligence apparat met for their informal weekly discussion. In most countries, the rivalry between the various separate intelligence services is legendary. In Russia, the KGB hates the guts of the GRU. In America, the FBI will not cooperate with the CIA. The British Security Service regards Scotland Yard's special branch as a crowd of flat-footed coppers, and there are so many crooks in the French SDECE that experts wonder whether the French intelligence service is part of the government or the underworld. But Israel is fortunate. Once a week, the chiefs of the 5 branches meet for a friendly chat without interdepartmental friction. It is one of the dividends of being a nation surrounded by enemies. At these meetings, coffee and soft drinks are passed round. Those present use first-name terms to each other. The atmosphere is relaxed, and more work gets done than could be effected by a torrent of written memoranda. It was to this meeting that the controller of the Mossad, head of the joint 5 services of Israeli intelligence, General Meir Amit, was travelling on the morning of December 4th. Beyond the windows of his long, black, chauffeur-driven limousine, a fine dawn was beaming down on the whitewashed sprawl of Tel Aviv. But the general's mood failed to match it. He was a deeply worried man. The cause of his worry was a piece of information that had reached him in the small hours of the morning, a small fragment of knowledge to be added to the immense file in the archives, but vital, for the file into which that dispatch from one of his agents in Cairo would be added was the file on the rockets of Helwan. The 42-year-old general's poker face betrayed nothing of his feelings as the car swung round the Zena Circus and headed towards the northern suburbs of the capital. He leaned back in the upholstery of his seat and considered the long history of those rockets being built north of Cairo, which had already cost several men their lives and had cost his predecessor, General Isser Harel, his job. During the course of 1961, long before Nasser's 2 rockets went on public display in the streets of Cairo, the Israeli Mossad had learned of their existence. From the moment the first dispatch came through from Egypt, they had kept Factory 333 under constant surveillance. They were perfectly well aware of the large-scale recruitment by the Egyptians through the good offices of the Odessa of German scientists to work on the rockets of Helwan. It was a serious matter then. It became infinitely more serious in the spring of 1962. In May that year, Heinz Krug, the German recruiter of the scientists, made approaches to the Austrian physicist Dr. Otto Joklik in Vienna. Instead of allowing himself to be recruited, the Austrian professor made contact with the Israelis. What he had to say electrified Tel Aviv. He told the agent of the Mossad who was sent to interview him that the Egyptians intended to arm their rockets with warheads containing irradiated nuclear waste and cultures of bubonic plague. So important was the news that the controller of the Mossad, General Isser Harel, the man who had personally escorted the kidnapped Adolf Eichmann back from Buenos Aires to Tel Aviv, flew to Vienna to talk to Joklik himself. He was convinced the professor was right, a conviction corroborated by the news that the Cairo government had just purchased through a firm in Zurich a quantity of radioactive cobalt equivalent to 25 times their possible requirements for medical purposes. On his return from Vienna, Isser Harel went to see Premier David Ben-Gurion and urged that he be allowed to begin a campaign of reprisals against the German scientists who were either working in Egypt or about to go there. The old premier was in a quandary. On the one hand, he realized the hideous danger the new rockets and their genocidal warheads presented to his people. On the other, he recognized the value of the German tanks and guns due to arrive at any moment. Israeli reprisals on the streets of Germany might just be enough to persuade Chancellor Adenauer to listen to his foreign ministry faction and shut off the arms deal. Inside the Tel Aviv cabinet, there was a split developing, similar to the split inside the Bonn cabinet over the arms sales. Isser Harel and the foreign minister, Madame Golda Meir, were in favour of a tough policy against the German scientists. Shimon Peres and the army were terrified by the thought they might lose their precious German tanks. Ben-Gurion was torn between the two. He hit on a compromise. He authorized Harel to undertake a muted, discreet campaign to discourage German scientists from going to Cairo to help Nasser build his rockets. But Harel, with his burning gut-hatred of Germany and all things German, went beyond his brief. On September 11th, 1962, Heinz Krug disappeared. He had dined the previous evening with Dr. Kleinwachter, the rocket propulsion expert he was trying to recruit, and an unidentified Egyptian. On the morning of the 11th, Krug's car was found abandoned close to his home in a suburb of Munich. His wife immediately claimed he had been kidnapped by Israeli agents, but the Munich police found not a trace either of Krug or of evidence as to his kidnappers. In fact, he had been abducted by a group of men led by a shadowy figure called Leon, and his body dumped in the Starnberg Lake, assisted to the weed bed by a corset of heavy link chain. The campaign then turned against the Germans in Egypt already. On November 27th, a registered package, posted in Hamburg and addressed to Professor Wolfgang Pilz, the rocket scientist who had worked for the French, arrived in Cairo. It was opened by his secretary, Miss Hannelore Wender. In the ensuing explosion, the girl was maimed and blinded for life. On November 28th, another package, also posted in Hamburg, arrived at Factory 333. By this time, the Egyptians had set up a security screen for arriving parcels. It was an Egyptian official in the mail room who cut the cord. 5 dead and 10 wounded. On the 29th, the third package was defused without an explosion. By February 20th, 1963, Harel's agents had turned their attention once again to Germany. Dr. Kleinwachter, still undecided whether to go to Cairo or not, was driving back home from his laboratory at Lörrach, near the Swiss frontier, when a black Mercedes barred his route. He threw himself to the floor as a man emptied his automatic through the windscreen. Police subsequently discovered the black Mercedes abandoned. It had been stolen earlier in the day. In the glove compartment was an identity card and the name of Colonel Ali Samir. Inquiries revealed this was the name of the chief of the Egyptian Secret Service. Isser Harel's agents had got their message across, with a touch of black humour for good measure. By now, the reprisal campaign was making headlines in Germany. It became a scandal with the Bengal affair. On March 2nd, the young Heidi Gürke, daughter of Professor Paul Gürke, pioneer of Nasser's rockets, received a telephone call at her home in Freiburg, Germany. A voice suggested she meet the caller at the Three Kings Hotel in Basel, Switzerland, just over the border. Heidi informed the General Police, who tipped off the Swiss. They planted a bugging device in the room that had been booked for the meeting. During the meeting, 2 men in dark glasses warned Heidi Gürke and her young brother to persuade their father to get out of Egypt if he valued his life. Tailed to Zurich and arrested the same night, the 2 men went on trial at Basel on June 10th, 1963. It was an international scandal. The chief of the 2 agents was Yosef Bengal, Israeli citizen. The trial went well. Professor Yoklek testified as to the warheads of plague and radioactive waste, and the judges were scandalized. Making the best of a bad job, the Israeli government used the trial to expose the Egyptian intent to commit genocide. Shocked, the judges acquitted the 2 accused. But back in Israel, there was a reckoning. Although the German Chancellor Adenauer had personally promised Ben-Gurion he would try to stop German scientists taking part in the Hell-1 rocket building, Ben-Gurion was humiliated by the scandal. In a rage, he rebuked General Isser Harel for the lengths to which he had gone in his campaign of intimidation. Harel riposted with vigour and handed in his resignation. To his surprise, Ben-Gurion accepted it, proving the point that no one in Israel is indispensable, not even the controller of intelligence. That night, June 20th, 1963, Isser Harel had a long talk with his close friend, General Meir Amit, then the head of military intelligence. General Amit could remember the conversation clearly, the taut, angry face of the Russian-born fighter, nicknamed Isser the Terrible. "I have to inform you, my dear Meir, that as from now, Israel is no longer in the retribution business. The politicians have taken over. I have tendered my resignation, and it has been accepted. I have asked that you be named my successor, and I believe they will agree." The ministerial committee that presides in Israel over the activities of the intelligence networks agreed. At the end of June, General Meir Amit became controller of intelligence. The knell had also sounded, however, for Ben-Gurion. The hawks of his cabinet, headed by Levi Eshkol and his own foreign minister, Golda Meir, forced his resignation, and on June 26, 1963, Levi Eshkol was named prime minister. Ben-Gurion, shaking his snowy head in anger, went down to his kibbutz in the Negev in disgust, but he stayed on as a member of the Knesset. Although the new government had ousted David Ben-Gurion, it did not reinstate Isser Harel. Perhaps it felt that Meir Amit was a general more likely to obey orders than the choleric Harel, who had become a legend in his own lifetime among the Israeli people and relished it. Nor were Ben-Gurion's last orders rescinded. General Amit's instructions remained the same, to avoid any more scandals in Germany over the rocket scientists. With no alternative, he turned the terror campaign against the scientists already inside Egypt. These Germans lived in the suburb of Mahdi, 7 miles south of Cairo on the northern bank of the Nile. A pleasant suburb, except that it was ringed by Egyptian security troops, and its German inhabitants were almost prisoners in a gilded cage. To get at them, Meir Amit used his top agent inside Egypt, the riding school owner Wolfgang Lutz, who found himself from September 1963 onwards forced to take suicidal risks, which 16 months later would lead to his undoing. For the German scientists, already shaken badly by the series of bomb parcels sent from Germany, autumn 1963 became a nightmare. In the heart of Mahdi, ringed by Egyptian security guards, they began to get letters threatening their lives, posted from inside Cairo. Dr. Yosef Isaac received one which described his wife, his 2 children, and the type of work he was engaged on with remarkable precision, then told him to get out of Egypt and go back to Germany. All the other scientists got the same kind of letter. On September 27th, a letter blew up in the face of Dr. Kiermaier. For some of the scientists, this was the last straw. At the end of September, Dr. Pilz left Cairo for Germany, taking the unfortunate Fräulein Wender with him. Others followed, and the furious Egyptians were unable to stop them, for they could not protect them from the threatening letters. The man in the back of the limousine that bright winter morning in 1964 knew that his own agent, the supposedly pro-Nazi German Lutz, was the writer of the letters and the sender of the explosives. But he also knew the rocket program was not being halted. The information he had just received proved it. He flicked his eye over the decoded message once again. It confirmed simply that a virulent strain of bubonic bacillus had been isolated in the contagious diseases laboratory of Cairo Medical Institute, and that the budget of the department involved had been increased tenfold. The information left no doubt that despite the adverse publicity Egypt had received over the Ben Gal trial in Basel the previous summer, they were going ahead with the genocide program. Had Hoffmann been watching, he would have been forced to give Miller full marks for cheek. Leaving the penthouse office, he took the lift down to the 5th floor and dropped in to see Max Dorn, the magazine's legal affairs correspondent. "I've just been up to see Herr Hoffmann," he said, dropping into a chair in front of Dorn's desk. "Now I need some background. Mind if I pick your brains?" "Go ahead," said Dorn, assuming Miller had been commissioned to do a story for Comet. "Who investigates war crimes in Germany?" The question took Dorn aback. "War crimes?" "Yes. War crimes. Which authorities are responsible for investigating what happened in all the various countries we overran during the war, and finding and prosecuting the individuals guilty of mass murder? Oh, I see what you mean. Well, basically, it's the various Attorney General's offices in the provinces of West Germany. You mean they all do it? Dawn leaned back in his chair, at home in his own field of expertise. There are 16 provinces in West Germany. Each has a state capital and a state attorney general. Inside each SAG's office there is a department responsible for investigation into what are called crimes of violence committed during the Nazi era. Each state capital is allocated an area of the former Reich or of the occupied territories as its special responsibility. Such as? Asked Miller. Well, for example, all crimes committed by the Nazis and the SS in Italy, Greece and Polish Galicia are investigated by Stuttgart. The biggest extermination camp of all, Auschwitz, comes under Frankfurt. You may have heard there's a big trial coming up in Frankfurt next May of 22 former guards from Auschwitz. Then the extermination camps of Treblinka, Chelmno, Sobibor and Majdanek are investigated by Düsseldorf, Cologne. Munich is responsible for Belzec, Dachau, Buchenwald, Flossenburg. Most crimes in the Soviet Ukraine and the Lodz area of former Poland come under Hanover, and so on. Miller noted the information, nodding. Who is supposed to investigate what happened in the 3 Baltic states? He asked. Hamburg, said Dawn promptly, along with crimes in the areas of Danzig and the Warsaw sector of Poland. Hamburg? Said Miller. You mean it's right here in Hamburg? Yes, why? Well, it's Riga I'm interested in. Dawn made a moo. Oh, I see. The German Jews. Well, that's the pigeon of the SAG's office right here. If there had ever been a trial, or even an arrest, of anyone who had been guilty of crimes in Riga, it would have been here, in Hamburg. The trial would have been, said Dawn. The arrest could have been made anywhere. What's the procedure with arrests? Well, there's a book called the Wanted Book. In it is the name of every wanted war criminal with surname, first names and date of birth. Usually the SAG's office covering the area where the man committed the crimes spend years preparing the case against him before arrest. Then, when they are ready, they request the police of the state in which the man is living to arrest him. A couple of detectives go there and bring him back. If a very much wanted man is discovered, he can be arrested wherever he's discovered, and the appropriate SAG's office informed that he's being held. Then they go and bring him back. The trouble is, most of the big SS men are not living under their own names. Right, said Miller. Has there ever been a trial in Hamburg of anyone guilty of crimes committed in Riga? Not that I remember, said Dawn. Would it be in the Cuttings Library? Sure. If it happened since 1950, when we started the Cuttings Library, it'll be there. Mind if we look? Asked Miller. No problem. The library was in the basement, tended by 5 archivists in grey smocks. It was almost half an acre in size, filled by row upon row of grey shelves on which reposed reference books of every kind and description. Round the walls, from floor to ceiling, were steel filing cabinets, the doors of each drawer indicating the contents of the files within. "What do you want?" asked Dawn, as the chief librarian approached. "Rochman, Edward," said Miller. "Personal index section this way," said the librarian, and led the way along one wall. He opened a cabinet door labelled ROA to ROZ, and flicked through it. "Nothing on Rochman, Edward," he said. Miller thought. "Do you have anything on war crimes?" he asked. "Yes," said the librarian. "War crimes and war trials section this way." They went along another 100 yards of cabinets. "Look under Riga," said Miller. The librarian mounted a stepladder and foraged. He came back with a red folder. It bore the label Riga, War Crimes Trial. Miller opened it. 2 pieces of newsprint the size of large postage stamps fluttered out. Miller picked them up. Both were from the summer of 1950. One recorded that 3 SS privates went on trial for brutalities committed at Riga between 1941 and 1944. The other recorded they had all 3 been sentenced to long terms of imprisonment. Not long enough. They would all be free by late 1963. "Is that it?" asked Miller. "That's it," said the librarian. "Do you mean to say," said Miller, turning to Dawn, "that a section of the State Attorney General's office has been beavering away for 15 years on my tax money, and all they've got to show for it is 2 postage stamps?" Dawn was a rather establishment figure. "I'm sure they're doing their best," he said huffily. "I wonder," said Miller. They parted in the main hall 2 floors up, and Miller went out into the rain. The building in the northern suburbs of Tel Aviv that houses the headquarters of the Mossad excites no attention, even from its nearest neighbours. The entrance to the underground car park of the office block is flanked by quite ordinary shops. On the ground floor is a bank, and in the entrance hall, before the plate-glass doors that lead into the bank, is a lift, a board stating the business of the firms on the floor above, and a porter's desk for inquiries. The board reveals that inside the block are the offices of several trading companies, 2 insurance firms, an architect, an engineering consultant, and an import-export company on the top floor. Inquiries for any of the firms below the top floor will be met courteously. Questions asked about the top-floor company are politely declined. The company on the top floor is the front for the Mossad. The room where the chiefs of Israeli intelligence meet is bare and cool, white-painted, with a long table and chairs round the walls. At the table sit the 5 men who control the branches of intelligence. Behind them on the chairs sit clerks and stenographers. Other non-members can be seconded for a hearing if required, but this is seldom done. The meetings are classified top secret, for all confidences may be aired. At the head of the table sits the controller of the Mossad. Founded in 1937, its full name, Mossad Aliyah Bet, or Organization for the Second Immigration, the Mossad was the first Israeli intelligence organ. Its first job was to get Jews from Europe to a safe berth in the land of Palestine. After the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, it became the senior of all intelligence organs, its controller automatically the head of all the 5. To the controller's right sits the chief of the Aman, the military intelligence unit, whose job is to keep Israel informed of the state of war readiness of her enemies. The man who held the job at that time was General Aharon Yariv. To the left sits the chief of the Shabak, sometimes wrongly referred to as the Shin Bet. These letters stand for Sherut Bitachon, the Hebrew for security service. The full title of the organ that watches over Israel's internal security, the only internal security, is Sherut Bitachon Klali, and it is from these 3 words that the abbreviation Shabak is taken. Beyond these 2 men sit the last 2 of the 5. One is the Director General of the Research Division of the Foreign Ministry, charged specifically with the evaluation of the political situation in Arab capitals, a matter of vital importance to the security of Israel. The other is the Director of a service solely occupied with the fate of Jews in the countries of persecution. These countries include all the Arab countries and all the communist countries. So that there shall be no overlapping of activities, the weekly meetings enable each chief to know what the other departments are doing. 2 other men are present as observers, the Inspector General of Police and the head of the Special Branch, the executive arms of the Shabak in the fight against terrorism inside the country. The meeting on that day was quite normal. Mayor Amit took his place at the head of the table and the discussion began. He saved his bombshell until the last. When he had made his statement, there was silence, as the men present, including the aides scattered round the walls, had a mental vision of their country dying as the radioactive and plague warheads slammed home. "The point surely is," said the head of the Shabak at last, "that those rockets must never fly. If we cannot prevent them making warheads, we have to prevent the warheads ever taking off." "Agreed," said Amit, taciturn as ever. "But how?" "Hit them," growled Yariv. "Hit them with everything we've got. Asa Weizmann's jets can take out Factory 333 in one raid." "And start a war with nothing to fight with," replied Amit. "We need more planes, more tanks, more guns before we can take Egypt. I think we all know, gentlemen, that war is inevitable. Nasser is determined on it, but he will not fight until he is ready. But if we force it on him now, the simple answer is that he, with his Russian weaponry, is more ready than we are. There was silence again. The head of the Foreign Ministry Arab section spoke. Our information from Cairo is that they think they will be ready in early 1967, rockets and all. We will have our tanks and guns by then, and our new French jets, replied Yariv. Yes, and they will have those rockets from Helwan, 400 of them. Gentlemen, there is only one answer. By the time we are ready for Nasser, those rockets will be in silos all over Egypt. They'll be unreachable. For once in their silos and ready to fire, we must not simply take out 90% of them, but all of them. And not even Ezer Weizmann's fighter pilots can take them all, without exception. Then we have to take them in the factory at Helwan, said Yariv with finality. Agreed, said Amit, but without a military attack. We shall just have to try to force the German scientists to resign before they have finished their work. Remember, the research stage is almost at an end. We have 6 months. After that, the Germans won't matter anymore. The Egyptians can build the rockets once they're designed down to the last nut and bolt. Therefore, I shall set up the campaign against the scientists in Egypt and keep you informed. For several seconds there was silence again, as the unspoken question ran through the minds of all those present. It was one of the men from the Foreign Ministry who finally voiced it. Couldn't we discourage them inside Germany again? General Amit shook his head. No, that remains out of the question in the prevailing political climate. The orders from our superiors remain the same. No more muscle tactics inside Germany. For us, from henceforth, the key to the rockets of Helwan lies inside Egypt. General Meir Amit, controller of the Mossad, was not often wrong, but he was wrong that time. For the key to the rockets of Helwan lay in a factory inside West Germany. Chapter 6. It took Miller a week before he could get an interview with the chief of section in the department of the Hamburg Attorney General's office responsible for investigation into war crimes. He suspected Dorn had found out that he was not working at Hoffmann's behest and had reacted accordingly. The man he confronted was nervous, ill at ease. You must understand I have only agreed to see you as a result of your persistent inquiries, he began. That's nice of you all the same, said Miller ingratiatingly. I want to inquire about a man whom I assume your department must have under permanent investigation, called Eduard Roschmann. Roschmann, said the lawyer. Roschmann, repeated Miller, captain of the SS, commandant of Riga Ghetto from 1941 to 1944. I want to know if he's alive. If not, where he's buried. If you have found him, if he has ever been arrested, and if he has ever been on trial. If not, where is he now? The lawyer was shaken. Good God, I can't tell you that, he said. Why not? It's a matter of public interest, enormous public interest. The lawyer had recovered his poise. I hardly think so, he said smoothly. Otherwise we would be receiving constant inquiries of this nature. Actually, so far as I can recall, yours is the first inquiry we've ever had from a member of the public. Actually, I am a member of the press, said Miller. Yes, that may be, but I'm afraid as regards this kind of information, that only means you're entitled to as much as one would give a member of the public. How much is that? Asked Miller. I'm afraid we are not empowered to give information regarding the progress of our inquiries. Well, that's not right to start with, said Miller. Oh, come now, Herr Miller. You would hardly expect the police to give you information about the progress of their inquiries in a criminal case. I would. In fact, that's just what I do. The police are customarily very helpful in issuing bulletins on whether an early arrest may be expected. Certainly they'd tell a press inquiry if their main suspect was to their knowledge alive or dead. It helps their relations with the public. The lawyer smiled thinly. I'm sure you perform a very valuable function in that regard, he said. but from this department no information may be issued of the state of progress of our work." He seemed to hit on a point of argument. "Let's face it, if wanted criminals knew how close we were to completing the case against them, they'd disappear." "That may be so," riposted Miller, "but the records show your department has only put on trial 3 privates who were guards at Riga, and that was in 1950, so the men were probably in pre-trial detention when the British handed over to your department. So the wanted criminals don't seem to be in much danger of being forced to disappear." Really, that's a most unwarranted suggestion. "All right, so your inquiries are progressing. It still wouldn't harm your case if you were to tell me quite simply whether Edward Rochman is under investigation and where he now is. All I can say is that all matters concerning the area of responsibility of my department are under constant inquiry. I repeat, constant inquiry. And now I really think, Herr Miller, there is nothing more I can do to help you." He rose, and Miller followed suit. "Don't bust a gut," he said, as he walked out. It was another week before Miller was ready to move. He spent it mainly at home, reading 6 books concerned in whole or in part with the war along the Eastern Front, and things that had been done in the camps in the occupied Eastern territories. It was the librarian at his local reading library who mentioned the Z Commission. "It's in Ludwigsburg," he told Miller. "I read about it in a magazine. Its full name is the Central Federal Agency for the Elucidation of Crimes of Violence Committed During the Nazi Era. That's a bit of a mouthful, so people call it the Zentrale Stelle for short. Even shorter, the Z Commission. It's the only organization in the country that hunts Nazis on a nationwide, even an international level." "Thanks," said Miller as he left. "I'll see if they can help me." Miller went to his bank the next morning, made out a cheque to his landlord for 3 months' rent to cover January to March, and drew the rest of his bank balance in cash, leaving a 10-mark note to keep the account open. He kissed Ziggy before she went off to work at the club, telling her he would be gone for a week, maybe more. Then he took the Jaguar from its underground home and headed south towards the Rhineland. The first snows had started, whistling in off the North Sea, slicing in flurries across the wide stretches of the Autobahn as it swept south of Bremen and into the flat plain of Lower Saxony. He paused once for coffee after 2 hours, then pressed on across North Rhine-Westphalia. Despite the wind, he enjoyed driving down the Autobahn in bad weather. Inside the XK-150S, he had the impression of being in the cockpit of a fast plane, the dashboard lights glowing dully under the fascia, and, outside, the descending darkness of a winter's night, the icy cold, the slanting flurries of snow caught for a moment in the harsh beam of the headlights, whipping past the windscreen and back into nothingness again. He stuck to the fast lane, as always, pushing the Jag to close to 100 miles an hour, watching the growling hulks of the heavy lorries swish past to his right as he overtook. By 6 in the evening he was beyond the Hahn junction, and the glowing lights of the Ruhr began to be dimly discernible to his right through the darkness. He never ceased to be amazed by the Ruhr. Mile after mile after mile of factories and chimneys, towns and cities so close as to be in effect one gigantic city 100 miles long and 50 broad. When the Autobahn went into an overpass, he could look down to the right and see it stretching away into the December night, thousands of hectares of lights and mills, aglow from 1,000 furnaces churning out the wealth of the economic miracle. 14 years ago, as he travelled through it by train towards his school holiday in Paris, it had been rubble, and the industrial heart of Germany was hardly even beating. Impossible not to feel proud of what the people had done since then. Just so long as I don't have to live in it, he thought, as the giant signs of the Cologne Ring began to come up in the light of the headlamps. From Cologne he ran southeast, past Wiesbaden and Frankfurt, Mannheim and Heilbronn, and it was late that evening when he cruised to a halt in front of a hotel in Stuttgart, the nearest city to Ludwigsburg, where he spent the night. Ludwigsburg is a quiet and inoffensive little market town set in the rolling, pleasant hills of Württemberg, 15 miles north of the state capital of Stuttgart. Set in a quiet road off the High Street, to the extreme embarrassment of the town's upright inhabitants, is the home of the Z Commission, a small, understaffed, underpaid, overworked group of men whose job and dedication in life is to hunt down the Nazis and the SS guilty during the war of the crimes of mass murder. Before the statute of limitations eliminated all SS crimes with the exception of murder and mass murder, those being sought might have been guilty only of extortion, robbery, grievous bodily harm, including torture, and a variety of other forms of unpleasantness. Even with murder, as the only remaining charge able to be brought, the Z Commission still had 170,000 names in its files. Not unnaturally, the main effort had been, and still is, to track down the worst few thousand of the mass murderers, if and where possible. Deprived of any powers of arrest, able only to request the police of the various states of Germany to make an arrest when positive identification has already been made, unable to squeeze more than a pittance each year out of the federal government in Bonn, the men of Ludwigsburg worked solely because they were dedicated to the task. There were 80 detectives on the staff, and 50 investigating attorneys. Of the former group, all were young, below the age of 35, so that none could possibly have had any implication in the matters under examination. The lawyers were mainly older, but vetted to ensure that they too were uninvolved with events prior to 1945. The lawyers were mainly taken from private practice, to which they would one day return. The detectives knew their careers were finished. No police force in Germany wanted to see on its staff a detective who had once served a term at Ludwigsburg. For detectives prepared to hunt the SS in West Germany, promotion was finished in any other police force in the country. Quite accustomed to see their requests for cooperation ignored in over half the states, to see their loaned files go unaccountably missing, to see the quarry suddenly disappear after an anonymous tip-off, the Z-men worked on as best they might at a task they realized was not in accordance with the wishes of the majority of their fellow countrymen. Even on the streets of the smiling town of Ludwigsburg, the men on the staff of the Z Commission went ungreeted and unacknowledged by the citizens to whom their presence brought an undesired notoriety. Peter Miller found the commission at 58 Schorndorfer Strasse, a large former private house set inside an 8-foot-high wall. 2 massive steel gates barred the way up the drive. To one side was a bell handle which he pulled. A steel shutter slid back, and a face appeared. The inevitable gatekeeper. "Please." "I would like to speak to one of your investigating attorneys," said Miller. "Which one?" said the face. "I don't know any names," said Miller. "Any one will do. Here is my card." He thrust his press card through the aperture, forcing the man to take it. Then at least he knew it would go inside the building. The man shut the hatch and went away. When he came back, it was to open the gate. Miller was shown up the 5 stone steps of the front door, closed against the clear but icy winter air. Inside it was stuffily hot from the central heating. Another porter emerged from a glass-fronted booth to his right and showed him into a small waiting room. "Someone will be with you directly," he said, and shut the door. The man who came 3 minutes later was in his early 50s, mild-mannered and courteous. He handed Miller back his press card and asked, "What can I do for you?" Miller started at the beginning, explaining briefly about Tauber, the diary, his inquiries into what happened to Eduard Roschmann. The lawyer listened intently. "Fascinating," he said at last. "The point is, can you help me?" "I wish I could," said the man, and for the first time since he had started asking questions about Roschmann in Hamburg weeks before, Miller believed he had met an official who genuinely would like to help him. "But the point is, although I am prepared to accept your inquiries as completely sincere, I am bound hand and foot by the rules that govern our continued existence here, which are, in effect, that no information may be given out about any wanted SS criminal to anyone other than a person supported by the official backing of one of a specific number of authorities." "In other words, you can tell me nothing," said Miller. "Please understand," said the lawyer, This office is under constant attack. Not openly, no one would dare, but privately within the corridors of power. We are incessantly being sniped at. Our budget, such powers as we have, are terms of reference. We are allowed no latitude where the rules are concerned. Personally, I would like to engage the alliance of the press of Germany to help, but it's forbidden. I see, said Miller. Do you then have any newspaper cuttings reference library? No, we don't. Is there in Germany at all a newspaper cuttings reference library that is open to an inquiry by a member of the public? No. The only newspaper cuttings libraries in the country are compiled and held by the various newspapers and magazines. The most comprehensive is reputed to be that of Der Spiegel magazine. After that, Comet has a very good one. I find this rather odd, said Miller. Where in Germany today does a citizen inquire about the progress of investigation into war crimes and for background material on wanted SS criminals? The lawyer looked slightly uncomfortable. I'm afraid the ordinary citizen can't do that, he said. All right, said Miller. Where are the archives in Germany that refer to the men of the SS? There's one set here, in the basement, said the lawyer, and ours is all composed of photostats. The originals of the entire card index of the SS were captured in 1945 by an American unit. At the last minute, a small group of the SS stayed behind at the castle where they were stored in Bavaria and tried to burn the records. They got through about 10% before the American soldiers rushed in and stopped them. The rest were all mixed up. It took the Americans, with some German help, 2 years to sort out the rest. During those 2 years, a number of the worst SS men escaped after being temporarily in Allied custody. Their dossiers could not be found in the muddle. Since the final classification, the entire SS index has remained in Berlin, still under American ownership and direction. Even we have to apply to them if we want something more. Mind you, they're very good about it, no complaints at all about cooperation from that quarter. And that's it? Asked Miller. Just 2 sets in the whole country? That's it, said the lawyer. I repeat, I wish I could help you. Incidentally, if you should get anything on Rochman, we'd be delighted to have it. Miller thought. If I find anything, there are only 2 authorities that can do anything with it. The Attorney General's office in Hamburg, and you, right? Yes, that's all, said the lawyer. And you're more likely to do something positive with it than Hamburg. Miller made it a flat statement. The lawyer gazed fixedly at the ceiling. Nothing that comes here that is of real value gathers dust on a shelf, he observed. Okay, point taken, said Miller, and rose. One thing, between ourselves, are you still looking for Edward Rochman? Between ourselves, yes, very much. And if he were caught, there'd be no problems about getting a conviction. None at all, said the lawyer. The case against him is tied up solid. He'd get hard labour for life without the option. Give me your phone number, said Miller. The lawyer wrote it down and handed Miller the piece of paper. There's my name and 2 phone numbers, home and office. You can get me any time, day or night. If you get anything new, just call me from any phone box on direct dial. In every state police force there are men I can call and know I'll get action if necessary. There are others to avoid, so call me first, right? Miller pocketed the paper. I'll remember that, he said as he left. Good luck, said the lawyer. It's a long drive from Stuttgart to Berlin, and it took Miller most of the following day. Fortunately, it was dry and crisp, and the tuned Jaguar ate the miles northwards, past the sprawling carpet of Frankfurt, past Kassel and Göttingen to Hanover. Here he followed the branch off to the right, from Autobahn E4 to E8, and the border with East Germany. There was an hour delay at the Marienborn checkpoint while he filled out the inevitable currency declaration forms, transit visas to travel through the 110 miles of East Germany to West Berlin, and while the blue-uniformed customs men and the green-coated People's Police, fur-hatted against the cold, poked around in and under the Jaguar. The customs man seemed torn between the frosty courtesy required of a servant of the German Democratic Republic towards a national of revanchist West Germany and one young man's desire to examine another's sports car. 20 miles beyond the border, the great motorway bridge reared up to cross the Elbe, where in 1945 the British, honourably obeying the rules laid down at Yalta, had halted their advance on Berlin. To his right, Miller looked down at the sprawl of Magdeburg and wondered if the old prison still stood. There was a further delay at the entry into West Berlin, where again the car was searched, his overnight case emptied onto the customs bench, and his wallet opened to see he had not given all his West marks away to the people of the workers' paradise on his progress down the road. Eventually he was through, and the Jaguar roared past the Avus circuit towards the glittering ribbon of the Kurfürstendamm, brilliant with Christmas decorations. It was the evening of December 17th. He decided not to go blundering into the American Document Center the same way he had the Attorney General's office in Hamburg or the Z Commission in Ludwigsburg. Without official backing, he had come to realize no one got anywhere with Nazi files in Germany. The following morning he called Karl Brandt from the main post office. Brandt was aghast at his request. "I can't," he said down the phone. "I don't know anyone in Berlin." "Well, think. You must have come across someone from the West Berlin force at one of the colleges you attended. I need him to vouch for me when I get there," shouted Miller back. "I told you I don't want to get involved." "Well, you are involved." Miller waited a few seconds before putting in the body blow. "Either I get a look at that archive officially, or I blow in and say you sent me." "You wouldn't do that," said Brandt. "I bloody well would. I'm fed up being pushed from pillar to post around this damn country, so find somebody who'll get me in there officially. Let's face it, the request will be forgotten within the hour once I've seen those files." "I'll have to think," said Brandt, stalling for time. "I'll give you an hour," said Miller. "Then I'm calling back." He slammed down the receiver. An hour later, Brandt was as angry as ever, and more than a little frightened. He heartily wished he had kept the diary to himself and thrown it away. "There's a man I was at detective college with," he said down the phone. "I didn't know him well, but he's now with Bureau 1 of the West Berlin Force. That deals with the same subject." "What's his name?" "Schiller. Volkmar Schiller, detective inspector." "I'll get in touch with him," said Miller. "No, leave him to me. I'll ring him today and introduce you to him. Then you can go and see him. If he doesn't agree to get you in, don't blame me. He's the only one I know in Berlin." 2 hours later, Miller rang Brandt back. Brandt sounded relieved. "He's gone away on leave," he said. "They tell me he's doing Christmas duty, so he's away until Monday." "But it's only Wednesday," said Miller. "That gives me 4 days to kill." "I can't help it. He'll be back on Monday morning. I'll ring him then." Miller spent 4 boring days hanging around West Berlin waiting for Schiller to come back off leave. Berlin was completely involved, as the Christmas of 1963 approached, with the issue by the East Berlin authorities for the first time since the wall had been built in August 1961 of passes enabling West Berliners to go through the wall and visit relatives living in the eastern sector. The progress of the negotiations between the two sides of the city had held the headlines for days. Miller spent one of his days that weekend by going through the Heinestrasse checkpoint into the eastern half of the city, as a West German citizen was able to do on the strength of his passport alone, and dropped in on a slight acquaintance, the Reuter correspondent in East Berlin. But the man was up to his neck in work on the wall passes story, so after a cup of coffee he left and returned to the West. On Monday morning he went to see Detective Inspector Volkmar Schiller. To his great relief, the man was about his own age, and seemed, unusually for an official of any kind in Germany, to have his own cavalier attitude to red tape. Doubtless he would not get far, thought Miller, but that was his problem. He explained briefly what he wanted. "I don't see why not," said Schiller. "The Americans are pretty helpful to us in Bureau 1. Because we're charged by Willy Brandt with investigating Nazi crimes, we're in there almost every day." They took Miller's Jaguar and drove out to the suburbs of the city, to the forests and lakes, and at the bank of one of the lakes arrived at No. 1 Wasserkäferstieg in the suburb of Zehlendorf, Berlin 37. The building was a long, low, single-story affair set amid the trees. "Is that it?" said Miller incredulously. "That's it," said Schiller. "Not much, is it? The point is, there are 8 floors below ground level. That's where the archives are stored, in fireproof vaults." They went through the front door to find a small waiting room with the inevitable porter's lodge on the right. The detective approached it and proffered his police card. He was handed a form, and the pair of them repaired to a table and filled it out. The detective filled in his name and rank, then asked, "What was the chap's name again?" "Roschmann," said Miller. "Edward Roschmann." The detective filled it in and handed the form back to the clerk in the front office. "It takes about 10 minutes," said the detective. They went into the larger room, set out with rows of tables and chairs. After a quarter of an hour, another clerk quietly brought them a file and laid it on the desk. It was about an inch thick, stamped with the single title, Roschmann, Edward. Volkmar Schiller rose. "If you don't mind, I'll be on my way," he said. "I'll find my own way back. Mustn't stop away too long after a week's leave. If you want anything photostated, ask the clerk." He gestured to a clerk sitting on a dais at the other end of the reading room, no doubt to ensure no visitors tried to remove pages from the files. Miller rose and shook hands. "Many thanks." "Not at all." Ignoring the other 3 or 4 readers hunched over their desks, Miller put his head between his hands and started to peruse the SS's own dossier on Edward Roschmann. It was all there. Nazi party number, SS number, application form for each, filled out and signed by the man himself, result of his medical check, appreciation of him after his training period, self-written curriculum vitae, transfer papers, officers' commission, promotion certificates, right up to April 1945. There were also 2 photographs taken for SS records, 1 full face, 1 profile. They showed a man of 6 feet 1 inch, hair shorn close to the head with a parting on the left, staring at the camera with a grim expression, a pointed nose, and a lipless slit of a mouth. Miller began to read. Edward Roschmann was born on August 25th, 1908, in the Austrian town of Graz, a citizen of Austria, son of a highly respectable and honest brewery worker. He attended kindergarten, junior, and high school in Graz. He attended college to try to become a lawyer, but failed. In 1931, at the age of 23, he began work in the brewery where his father had a job, and in 1937 was transferred to the administrative department from the brewery floor. The same year, he joined the Austrian Nazi Party and the SS, both at that time banned organizations in neutral Austria. A year later, Hitler annexed Austria and rewarded the Austrian Nazis with swift promotions all round. In 1939, at the outbreak of war, he volunteered for the Waffen-SS, was sent to Germany, trained during the winter of 1939 and the spring of 1940, and served in a Waffen-SS unit in the overrunning of France. In December 1940, he was transferred back from France to Berlin. Here, somebody had handwritten in the margin the word cowardice, and in January 1941 was seconded to the SD and 3 of the RSHA. In July 1941, he set up the first SD post in Riga, and the following month became commandant of Riga Ghetto. He returned to Germany by ship in October 1944, and after handing over the remainder of the Jews of Riga to the SD of Danzig, returned to Berlin to report. cautiously.
He returned to his desk
with a
in
revolver
Berlin
in his
HQ
hand
of the
was a
SS
soldier in
and
full
remained
battle
there
uniform,
awaiting reassignment.
one that I had
The
never
last
seen before.
SS document in the file
He was evidently an officer,
never
for he was
completed,
accompanied by a
presumably
soldier in a
because
flat,
the
round
meticulous
tin
little
hat
clerk in
who
Berlin
carried a
SS
rifle.
headquarters reassigned
They just
himself
stood
rather
there in
quickly
silence,
May 1945.
looking round at the courtyard of the
Attached to the
prison.
back of the bunch of documents
In one
was
corner were
last
stacked
one,
about 50
apparently
corpses,
affixed by an American
those who had
hand
died in the
since end of
past
the
2
war.
weeks and whom
It
no
was a
one had
single
the
sheet
strength to
bearing
bury.
typewritten words.
Others, half alive, lay around the walls trying to soak up a little of the spring sunshine.